Welcome. Don't adjust your dial. Lofi Poli Sci podcast coming at you. Michael Pickering here with our good friend Gregory Day, a writer, director, bookseller, and the voice behind HipsvilleAD, the fanatical septic god of subcultures and fervent rambling of all breeds of cinematic pleasures. Gregory Day, how are you doing out there?
I'm great, man. How are you?
Oh, fantastic. And let's jump right into this juicy list you have for us. What are we doing today?
Yeah, today we're doing top 10 comic book movie classics. This will be a list of flicks that either predate the corporate superhero cycle we're in, or is outside of that corporate offerings we have.
All right, I'm so ready to get into this one. All right, let's jump in. What's coming in at number 10?
Yeah, number 10, we got our little base level entry flick here. We're talking about Batman the movie from 1966, the Adam West Batman, for all you people who know who that is. This is a perfect, colorful, goofy comic book movie that's got it just illustrates, the silliness of what it means to be a man dressed in a bad outfit saving Gotham City from goofy colored criminals, and it's kind of the opposite of everything that Batman represents in our current culture. In this film, it's him and Robin. It stems from the TV series of the 60s, and he faces off against four foes: the Riddler, who was really like sort of the main big bad guy of the TV series, the Joker, the Penguin, and Catwoman. It can't be fun. It's got all sorts of oddities, like Batman running around with a bomb trying to get rid of it. The Batboat, Batman being attacked by a shark, and has repellent for it, and then it turns out the shark is a robot, so he's got robot shark repellent on his belt. And it's goofy fun. It's got a lot of colors, and it's a great Sunday morning flick.
This was a great way to open up my Sunday morning with looking at trailers. I mean, this trailer was first and just ridiculous, simply ridiculous trailer. It was so fourth wall breaking and so batterific, if I may say. and to think, what really hits me is that for all the things cinema was doing at this time, the new wave movements that we've talked about all over the world, at the same time, we get this. And I've seen this when I saw it way back in the day, and they truly, truly don't care what people think about this movie. Like, they really took the kookiness of the comic books of that day and brought it straight to the big screen and didn't even try to take it serious. I mean, it's amazing. It is amazing.
Yeah, I think it's something to say about the idea of mainstream culture taking comic books seriously, which we'll talk about as we get through the list. But this adaptation of Batman is not serious at all. And it kind of all can be summed up with Batman running around with a giant bomb in his hand and looking at the screen and saying, "Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb."
Yes, indeed. All right, then what do we have for number 9?
Yeah, number 9. I should preface that some of these films on this list are not actual adaptations of comics, but influenced by comics as well. And the first one I want to talk about is a movie from 1955 called Artists and Models. It's a Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis movie, so the famous Martin and Lewis comedy duo. Which is most of their films were like comedies and musicals, because Dino always got to sing at least one tune in those movies. But this is a film where they play roommates, and Dino is a comic book writer, and Jerry Lewis is sort of his man-child friend who has these nightmares at night, and he speaks about all these strange, weird plots going on in his dreams, and of course Dean Martin is stealing them for his comic book ideas. But the fantastic thing about this movie is that it's like Batman the movie. It's this colorful pop art film that incorporates all these great set pieces, because the director Frank Tashlin came from working on Looney Tunes, and it really started to incorporate a lot of those animated gags into live action. He was like one of the first filmmakers to do that. So there's all these like these wonderful gags you would see in cartoons, like people getting blown up and surviving, or just sort of like things that would kill a normal person, but kind of like these, breaking the reality of our world in cinema. Sure. Yeah. But the really great thing about this film is that while Dean Martin is creating these worlds based on Jerry Lewis's dreams, Jerry Lewis actually has some sort of formula in his mind that some bad guys want. It turns into like a real comic book plot of like Russian gangsters or Cold War espionage plot. It really turns into this pulp action plot of these guys who are after them because Jerry Lewis has dreamt up this formula that happens to be real. So it's a great way to show how pulp adventure and comic book aesthetics really started to get into mainstream cinema.
Interesting. And before I even go, let me ask you, what do you mean by like pulp genre or pulp influence?
Yeah, so if you think back about adventure stories of the 30s and 40s, or maybe even in the 20s, so you have like things like Dick Tracy or Conan or
Maltese
Tarzan.
Falcon.
Yeah, like mystery stuff could be kind of going there too. But it just these adventure stories that were printed in like dime store um, paperbacks, is serialized, of course, so you had a bunch of them to read. So just different aspects of adventure stories, I guess, of that time period.
Okay, cool. And I had not seen this one. I had not heard of it, but I definitely at least know who Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis are as far as like relevant actors of their time. But this trailer did make me think, and the way they kind of went through the motions of talking about color in the movie. Since this came out in 1955, was this maybe one of the early color films while black and white cinema was still going on? And I asked this question in particular because after watching the trailer, I really had no clue what this movie was about. It did seem kooky, but but that was like one of the big things I took from the trailer. Do you know?
No, it's not one of the earliest color films because color kind of goes back to Wizard of Oz coming out in the 30s. But
Okay.
I would say what they're really looking at is selling the idea of like Technicolor, which is the idea that if you go to the cinema to see a
Okay.
Technicolor production, it's going to look better than your television does. And the movie still looks amazing. I mean, there's some really great yellows and reds and blues. Primary colors, of course, are always great in Technicolor. Um, but yeah, it's just got this really deep, rich colors, and I think that's really what they're getting at as far as pushing that in the
That
advertisements.
makes that makes complete sense because back in the 50s, almost everyone still had black and white TVs. So the only way to
Yes.
see color was at cinema. All right. Okay, that makes sense. All right, good,
Yeah,
good,
yeah.
good. All right, now where are we going to number 8?
Yeah, number 8, we're talking about the first movie produced from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 1990. And I think people from our generation, you and I, should be very familiar with this, but I do feel like these characters are still hanging around in our pop culture today. But in 1990 was when the first live action film of this dropped. And the reason I want to talk about it is because, in a weird way, the movie stemmed from the cartoon series. Its
Right,
popularity was
right.
a huge smash in American culture, but that TV series was based on an underground comic book, and so it was really adapted for children into the TV show. But then when the film came out, it was sort of a mixture of this weird underground comic where it took place in a real gritty New York City, but it had these colorful characters at the center of it. So if you're not familiar with the Ninja Turtles, it's a these 4 turtles that are turned into human-sized um, beings from toxic waste in the sewer, and they're teenagers, so they have all this angst and love to party and listen to like hip hop and break dance, but they also are trained ninjas, and so they are also protecting the city of New York. And specifically, this flick, they're fighting the Foot Clan, which is another system of ninjas, the bad guys in the city, led by the Shredder, who is their ultimate villain. And so, yeah, this is something that was really weird, and just it really explores some of the strangest of comic books, like animals being turned into human-sized creatures by toxic waste. Um, it just, if you think about that's just a strange concept in itself, but then it was a huge um, cultural milestone, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, that this strange tale kind of took over. So yeah, I'm interested. I'm sure you've seen this one.
Yes. And I'll say a few things before I really dive into my thing. So Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles still very much in today's pop culture. They've had multiple movies over the past 10 to 5 years. I think the most recent one maybe in like 2018 or something like that, or 2019. There's still cartoons going on. Like, so Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles really kind of never left. They've been here since the 1980s in the cartoon, and even before that with the comic book. And I'll tell you one of the things I remember from the cartoon that I still think about today. It's they used to do at the end of the shows these little kind of like if you know type of things or
Hmm.
educational things, and Michelangelo would be brushing his teeth and Donatello walks up and turns off the water and he's like, hey, you don't need to waste water while you're brushing your teeth. And to this day I'm still like, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm like, turn off the water, Donatello
Oh yeah.
says don't need to waste. But anyway, so a classic. I think you're right, this is most certainly a classic, taking the story and having fun with it, but also having some really serious moments. Like the Shredder in here, the main villain, is portrayed as a serious character. And there are multiple, like, really family kind of storylines that you get attached to the characters. And then suddenly kookiness ensues, and people are on skateboards and eating pizza and stuff like this. But I'll actually admit to this one, though. I actually rewatched this within the past year or two. And relatively speaking, I think it still holds up 32 years later. Like the practical effects and the storyline and the script, like I was pretty amazed at how well it held up.
Yeah, yeah, I think it does really hold up, and I think you hit upon something there that I think is very important to telling a compelling story, especially when you're dealing with these kind of goofier aspects. Is that yeah, this movie does have its silly moments, um, things of like the turtles paying for pizza and stuff, and like kind of the jokes that go along with it. But I think a good balance to a story is effective, so you can kind of get to know these characters and have fun with them. But then once it does get to the plot where the Shredder comes in and they have to fight the Shredder, that it does get serious, and you do feel the weight of that part of the story. And I think it's really important to trying to tell a good story when you're making a movie.
And it's amazing. It's amazing to say that, that to feel the weight of a story while you're watching four teenage mutant ninja turtles fight a guy named Shredder as if he's
Uh-huh.
going to shred the cheese on their pizza, and you feel some emotional attachment. I mean,
Yeah, you
plus
do.
I don't think it's by chance that during the Cold War era and nuclear proliferation, we get a story about mutation and animals from toxic waste.
Hmm.
And so it's like, and especially if you think in the 1980s, you have Chernobyl, the Ukrainian nuclear plant that goes nuclear and melts down and throws all this radiation all over the world. And this story is kind of like, look, draw some attention to it.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so let's go on to continue our conversation about toxic waste and go to number 7.
Yeah, yeah. I think more related to what you're talking about here is a film from 1984 called The Toxic Avenger. This is not a film
Yes.
that is based on a comic, but was more of a parody of Marvel comics, really. So we have, if you're familiar with Marvel comics, the characters like the Hulk or Spider-Man are transformed by radiation, and like the Ninja Turtles, people are being transformed into things by toxic waste or radiation. But this is a parody of that, to where our main character is a scrawny little nerd who works at a gym who's picked on by a bunch of cokehead yuppies, and he is transformed into a deformed beefcake by toxic waste, by being jumped into a vat of toxic waste. And then he goes on to try to save his town, which is called Tromaville, because this is a trauma production, which is for those not in the know, is a low budget production studio who is still going strong today, who makes some great schlocky fun movies, but also have some good political messages in there most of the time. But yeah, this is when you really get to the point of talking about standing up, standing up for environmentalism and standing up against big business and protecting your local community from these things. And Toxie, the main character here, the hero of our story, does have to go up against these politicians who are trying to pollute their town and don't really give a shit about the citizens, and dump toxic waste all over it. So, but this is not like your ordinary superhero film. It is super gross and it is incredibly violent. People get their limbs ripped off, or Toxic just doesn't give a shit about criminals. Will kill a criminal in this film, but he's an enduring character, I would say.
When I saw this was on the list, I shook my head and smiled. And I was, I think this film it perfectly encapsulates what genre comic book movies are. And comic book movies today could come nowhere close to do what this film does. I mean, never, never.
Hmm.
Could you see even a parody comic book movie do something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think stuff like James Gunn has done, who worked for Troma when he was younger. He's gone on to do the Guardians of the Galaxy and the latest Suicide Squad movie.
Oh,
Yeah, I
interesting.
think yes, but I don't think it would go the lengths that this film goes. Um, there are some really offensive things in this film, um, and there are also some really violent things in this film. So I think it would come close to this. And I'm interested to see there's a remake coming out, I think, this year where Peter Dinklage is playing the Toxic Avenger. And
Really?
yeah, so I'm interested to see how that's going to
Wow.
play with a modern sensibility. Um,
No kidding.
yeah, so I think we could get close to it, but I don't think we would get quite to the level of um, of parody that this is going for.
That might be an interesting list for us one day. Um, Remakes of genre movies today.
Oh yeah. I do want to say also, kind of linking this film to the Ninja Turtles, is that this film also spawned a children's cartoon in the '90s. I'm not
Oh,
sure if you're
I
familiar with it.
forgot about that.
Yes, the Toxic Crusaders, which is probably more in spirit with Captain Planet because it was dealing with
Right.
environmentalism and pollution, but definitely Toxic had a team of other guys who were like him, so it was sort of similar to Ninja Turtles. But it's such a strange idea for a cartoon based on this kind of movie.
Oh, I really did completely forgot about Toxic Crusaders until you said that. All right, what do we have at number 6, my friend?
Yeah, number 6, we're hitting the '90s here again with a film that really illustrates the complexity and maturity of comic books at the time. And we're talking about The Crow from 1994. And as far as comic books go, they're kind of considered fair for children up until the '80s or late '80s, where writers started to really branch out and make comics for adults. Um, there may be some things that predate that, but really in the '80s is kind of considered like when Watchmen came out,
Sure.
or The Killing Joke, the Batman comic by Alan Moore. Neil Gaiman started writing Sandman, these sort of things. But right after that, James O'Barr, this creator, comes out with this comic book that he wrote about a man who is killed and his wife is killed, and he comes back from the dead to get revenge on the gang that killed him and wronged him. And this is a way for him as a creator to deal with the death of his own um, girlfriend, or I don't think they were married, but his fiance who died in a drunk driving accident. Um, and so he wrote this comic book to try to alleviate his own anxieties and feelings of depression out of that. And the film adaptation is just like a perfect way to adapt something to the screen like this. It's dark, it's serious, and it has a man dressed up in this face paint and everything. So, but it doesn't ever veer into goofiness, where everything is 100% believable. Yeah, this is a dark, violent revenge flick where I say dark because visually I don't even think the sun comes up until the end of the film, like maybe in the last scene. So, aesthetically it's dark, and it pulls a lot of influence from like post punk and new wave, and you can even see the illustrations of the character. The comic are based on like Robert Smith from The Cure, things like that. So yeah, this is a great picture to kind of look at when you want to see an adaptation of a comic that was intended for adults, and the movie was definitely intended for adults.
Yeah, so first off, I will say that this is the one trailer I watched on full screen this morning because I simply love this movie for so many reasons. Um, Secondly, if I were to take your list and make it my list, I would put this one at number 1 without a doubt. So, my friend, putting it at
Ooh.
number 6, what the hell, man? I don't know. All right. But I love this movie, and I think it's one of the best films that represents what the 90s were and how it was such a decade of pushing back against previous decades. And it was about finding its new identity going into a brand new millennia that was coming up soon enough. And it does, like you said, it does have a few one-liner jokes here and there that kind of makes it a little kooky, but it most certainly is a film that takes itself seriously. And it has one of my favorite quotes of all time that I still use. And I'm curious if you can guess what that quote is. Go ahead, give it a shot. Give it a shot.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm gonna assume you don't say it can't rain all the time because that would just be cheesy. But
Oh, that
I don't
is
know.
it. That is it. And how dare you
Is
say
it?
it's cheesy? How dare you, sir? How dare you? You put this at number 6 and you say it's a cheesy line. It's not. It's not.
Uh,
Okay. It's one of my
um,
mantras I live by.
okay, no, that's good. That's fair enough. Yeah, and one thing we don't know talking about. So anyone who's listening who's not familiar with this film, it was the movie that should have made Brandon Lee, son of Bruce Lee, a star, but he actually, he was tragically killed during the making of the film. But if you watch this film, if you don't know anything about him, um, I think you'd see what a movie star he would have been. Like he's just phenomenal in this movie.
I agree. This would have been the film that launched Brandon Lee's career without a doubt. Without a doubt. All right. Now let's move into our top 5. What do we have coming in at number 5?
Yeah, number 5. I wanted to discuss horror comics because horror comics are such a huge part of comic books, but maybe aren't necessarily a topic that is involved in the mainstream cinema of comic book adaptations. Especially because they don't involve superheroes, so they're kind of pushed off to the side. But one of the most successful television shows of all time is based on a horror comic, The Walking Dead. But we're not talking about
Oh,
that
that's a
today.
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about today is EC Comics, which brought us Tales from the Crypts and Vault of Horror and all these sort of like short story collections of horror stories. And although there is a 70s film based on Tales from the Crypt, the one film I wanted to talk about is an homage to that whole those the whole publications. It's Creepshow from 1982. And the reason I picked this over Tales from the Crypt is because Creepshow goes out of its way to incorporate like what the cover art looked like into the film with the opening credit sequence. It's got animated sequence to kind of reflect that. It's got introduction of panels into the frames, the colors that come in into the stories. The film itself is an anthology film, which sort of also represents how the comics were published because it'd be short stories in the comics, so it'd be these little horror stories. And it is a collaboration between two titans of horror, George A. Romero, who made Night of the Living Dead, and it was written by Stephen King, who's also in one of the shorts. But yeah, this is a fun horror film. It's with I think it's five great stories in it with all sorts of different horror things in it. But just watching it, you can really see the aesthetic of horror comics.
Yeah, you had The Crow at number 6, so I was like, all right, where is he going with this? He got to have some stuff at number 5. And then you come with Creepshow, and I'm like, all right, I never saw this before, but what we got, what we got? And then I'm like, wait, what? I was like, what is this? What's going on here? I was like I said, I never saw this, but it really came off as kind of like you said, a Tales from the Crypt kind of parody horror film. And I kind of wondered, like, would you consider this maybe like a predecessor to your scary movies or something like that, like real parody horror film that we would know more in the modern era?
Oh no, not at all. I don't think this is a parody. It's got some tongue in cheek comedy to it.
Okay.
Uh, and that's sort of the to alleviate the horror, but it's definitely not a parody. But I will say that it does
Okay.
in those humorous moments, it does kind of go uh towards more of the wholesome side of like because which I should preface this by saying these comics came out in the 50s, and
Oh wow.
they were a huge part of not to get on a tangent, but they basically um a huge part of this moral outrage against comic books of the time because parents thought they were ruining the minds of the young readers, and so they came up with this code for comic books, much like the MPAA for movies, or
Right.
what do you call it for music later on in the 90s with the parental advisory stickers. And so they came up with this code where, and then there was this censorship on them. So horror comics were responsible for kind of almost mainstream audiences demonizing comics with these graphic illustrations of dead people and violence and stuff. So but this movie Creepshow definitely takes some of that wholesomeness and kind of brings it in there, some of this maybe outdated um American ideas into the film, even though it's a product of the 80s. And that's, I think, some of where that goofiness comes from.
Gotcha, gotcha. I was wondering because the trailer, I mean, trailers can be misleading or so. And plus I wasn't quite sure what the plot line of it was. But I like that you brought up, that horror comic books were really in some part responsible for the comic book code on morals, which was, like you said, it was a huge debate going on in the 50s and 60s, people thinking that comic books were warping the minds of children and youth. And I think in many ways that same discussion kind of evolved later in the 90s and in the 2000s to be the exact same thing, except for take out the word comic books and put in video games.
Oh yes,
Um,
100%.
yeah, it's the exact same conversation. And like you rightfully brought up, music with parental advisory stickers and things like that. It's all the same conversation, just it's remarketed into different sectors of society to try to limit freedom as far as content being produced.
Yeah,
Um,
and we're talking about it in children's literature in a lot of these schools right now.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's all still relevant and it's still just a huge discussion that never got finished. All right, but let's keep going on to number 4 on your list.
Yeah, keep trucking along here. One thing I did want to talk about was Indy Comics, and if anyone doesn't know what that means, it means sort of self-published comics or smaller publishers. So in the world of comic books, there kind of have always been two massive companies that put out comics as far as like mainstream comics go, and that's Marvel and DC. And then there are some other smaller ones. Like if you're really into comics, you know who the smaller ones are. But indie comics are maybe people who self-publish their own comic books or get picked up by these smaller publishers. But I think aesthetically, a lot of these comics don't necessarily involve weird and strange things or superheroes or anything like that. There are a lot of comic books that are just about people and have a more literary quality to them. So I want to talk at least a little bit about that avenue with this choice. Number 4, we're talking about Ghost World from 2001. Ghost World was written and illustrated by Daniel Klaus, who's one of my favorite comic book writers and illustrators. And he wrote these little shorts in another publication where he was just about these two young girls who were their high school graduation is approaching, and it's just these little snapshots of their angst and their disgust and cynicism with their hometown, and they don't really know what's going to happen once they graduate, what's going to happen when they step into adulthood. And so this film is an adaptation of that, which all the shorts are kind of collected together as Ghost World in a graphic novel, so you can kind of read them, but there's no real plot from beginning to end. There's just these little short stories, basically. But the film itself is a really great adaptation of that by taking those little shorts and making it into a feature-length film about these two girls living in this town. One is played by Thora Birch and the other by a young Scarlett Johansson, and they're just bumming around town. They don't really like it much, and then the main character runs into a record collector played by Steve Buscemi, and it kind of starts to hit on like how there might be good things in your town, in your neighborhood. There might be good people who are around, but also there might be some cynical people around, and you just kind of have to choose what path you're going to go on. And I think this is a great example that comic books don't need to be about huge scale destruction and weird things about mutating into things or superpower or gaining superpowers, but they could just be about everyday life and the choices that you have to make in your life.
I couldn't agree with that more. That and this film in general, and I'll get back to it in a second, kind of took me to a time in cinema where you could more often see a lot of films in theater that were telling the simple everyday stories of our choices in life. And I had never heard of this, so obviously I'd never seen it, but you definitely see a ton of famous people in this movie, and it came out in 2001, and it kind of gave me like that 2000s vibe of that old MTV cartoon Daria.
Oh yes, yes.
It kind of gave me that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but it also made me think, like, at that time, no one knew what was going on at the turn of the millennium. Like
Oh yeah.
1999, 2000, 2001, we were all just trying to figure out anything and everything, just making different choices in life. And I really dug this trailer, and I think I am going to check this movie out.
Yeah. I would also recommend the comic book. You can get the collection for fairly cheap, probably anywhere you can find comics. And just like if speaking aesthetically, speaking of aesthetics, this comic it's two tones, so it's only like green and black. There's no whites in the frames.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the aesthetic of indie comics is they could be just very simple. And Daniel Klaus, I think, is a very effective storyteller where he could tell so much by using so little.
I like that. I like that because we're going from this choice and telling a simple story, but still getting so much from it. And then your next choice at number three is anything but a simple choice. Go ahead.
Yeah, number three, we're getting into manga. And so we talked about this briefly on another show. So I wanted to bring it
Right,
back up
right.
here and talk about it. But I couldn't think of a better adaptation to talk about manga. Because one, it's adapted to the screen in anime form by the person who wrote and illustrated the manga. So we're talking about, of course, Akira from 1988, the landmark anime film. I don't really know the context of what it meant for when the manga dropped, but I do understand it's also highly influential. I believe it's in 6 or 7 volumes in total. So it's a great big epic, whereas the film is 2 hour adaptation of that. And so if you're unfamiliar with Akira, it takes place in Neo Tokyo, which is, I believe, excuse me, after the second time a atomic bomb is dropped on Japan. And it's this futuristic world where the establishment is collapsing and there are these religious cults kind of in the streets, and biker gangs are running around everywhere. And two of the main characters are in one of these biker gangs. And things get really weird because there is something called Akira, and there are in relationship to that, there are these beings with sort of psychic powers or powers that extend from that. And Tetsuo, one of the main characters, gets infected with this or unlocks his ability, and things get really, really strange after that, where there's a lot of body horror and the second half of the film is very up for interpretation, I would say. But yeah, it's sort of like we talked about with Tetsuo the Iron Man, getting into these parts of Japanese culture with body horror and mutations and the effects of radiation upon their society and the effects of technological advances on their society. And to me, I just absolutely love this film, and especially for its weirdness, because it just really goes for it. And yeah, I'm interested to see, because you're a much bigger anime fan than I am. What's your thoughts on Akira are?
Oh, why don't you just go tell everyone I'm a nerd squared? Yes. Okay.
There's nothing wrong with anime. It's an
Sure,
amazing
sure.
medium.
That's right. Everyone now knows I love video games and anime, and I'm a political scientist. And let's just pile up anything more nerdy we can. And I normally carry a 20-sided dice in my pocket, but what that's for, that's on a different episode. This anime. So before anime, before this one, before Akira in 1988, anime and animation in general, like cartoons, wasn't really taken seriously, and you didn't really get that many films that took themselves seriously, and so much so that you wouldn't even call it a film. Like this film was about 2 hours long, but they created a new word for it, so they wouldn't call it cinema. They called it anime because they wanted to make sure, no, 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 this isn't film, this isn't cinema, this is anime, this is something different. But
Okay.
this one film here took itself serious, and it changed everything for anime. This is the beginning of an era. It's the building blocks of an international film movement that has never stopped and is still thriving today. Anime is still everywhere, and it's in all parts. It starts here with
Hmm.
Akira. Um, I think you're absolutely right that it goes into some extremely complex topics, especially during the second half of the film, and it does get into that body horror, which some later anime in the 90s kind of tackled as well. More current anime, I think, have stepped away from that because anime has sprung so much so into pop culture that now they're making serious anime that appeals to a wider audience. They're not just making anime to attract people who read manga or who read comic books. To think in a bigger terms of the whole conversation of today. Today, anime is made toward everybody. So yeah, I think this is a great choice to really represent the whole anime movement and what it is, and it all started here.
Yeah, yeah. I will say that as far as comic book adaptations go, I've at least flipped through the book itself, and as if you're into manga, mangas are traditionally in black and white, and then adapting that to the into anime, it comes into color, and then so like the iconic red jacket of the main character, is not necessarily in the, or not really it's in the manga, but it's not as visually striking in the manga because it's such a huge part of our pop culture now. That red jacket, or not his red jacket, but the bike is red, and like with his jacket with the pill in the back.
Right, right.
That stuff. But I will say, like, what really, to elaborate on, like, what really set this movie apart from the earlier iterations of anime is the animation, the attention to detail. Like, they animated just small, hand by hand, small sections of the frame to get these minute details into the frame, whether they're like city streets or interiors of like bars, or just like painstakingly crafted. And then to me, the thing that always stood out was the lens blur or the light blur from the bikes when they're racing. And I think that really stuck out to a lot of audiences because you could see the motion on the screen, and the idea that this is all done by hand still is just, it's just fantastic.
I think you're right. And I think it bridges the gap to where if this was non-anime, if it was a motion picture, we would be in which everything you just said, we'd be talking about cinematography, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about it in the scope of an anime, and cartoonist or animist artist drawing these things. And I think this is one of the first films that treated the background of the story itself as cinematography. And you get a beautiful landscape throughout this movie that we didn't see in animation before that.
Yeah. And I'm interested, I guess, because I've seen a few modern anime films, and I think in our culture, Miyazaki's films, the Studio Ghibli films, have really taken over as the largest interest. And I understand like there's a lot of television, like Cowboy Bebop and stuff, which I'm really into, but not necessarily. Cowboy Bebop's like 20 years old now.
Right.
But you watch a lot more anime, and I think we previously talked about how you thought that this picture specifically was a little dated, and I'm wondering if you could offer anything to me as something that's a modern example of anime that I should go check out, to try to get hip to something that is sort of cutting edge, or a new modern classic or something.
Oh, so you really got to throw me under the bus for being a nerd, huh? Modern choices of anime. All right,
Yeah,
so I
or
will tell
just
you.
one or whatever. Yeah.
So the newest thing out, and it's still in the middle of. Well, no, let me backtrack and give you a non-US example. I'd say one of the more recent ones that just wrapped up its, I think, fourth season not long ago is Attack on Titan. Is
Okay.
probably one of the more popular ones over the past, I don't know, 5 years or more.
Hmm.
It's really captivated international audiences. Um, Another one that's getting a restart for a continuation of the storyline that is, it's been several years since it's been finished, but it'll start back up in September, is Bleach.
Mm.
That's
Okay.
going to get started in a while, but I think those two are good examples. And
Mhm.
for a US, well, no, I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to go into it. There's another example, but I'm not
Okay.
throwing myself under that bus.
All right. All right.
After the episode, and
Yes.
for all you
Yeah.
listeners out there, yeah, you can come at me with what it is, but I'm not telling. All right, what's your number two on the
Yeah.
list?
Yeah, number two, I'm circling back to the idea of like where comics come from, and the general feeling of them. And so we're going back to the 60s, and this pick would make a great double feature with Batman 66. Talking about Danger Diabolic from 1968. This is an adaptation of an Italian comic book about a master thief who loves to steal from the rich and does not give to the poor. He loves collecting wealth and just screwing over the system. And he's got a supermodel girlfriend, and he's got fun gadgets and cars that can drive on the road and then turn into a boat as it goes into the ocean. And yeah, it's like the perfect villain movie, except for the villain is the main character, so you're kind of rooting for him to take down credit card companies and greedy banks and stuff. And it's kind of the opposite of James Bond. So this is the kind of guy that James Bond would be after in the 60s, not in the modern context. But yeah, he's dressed like a cat burglar. He's got different colors for his outfits and camouflage and on it in his surroundings. This film is so colorful and psychedelic and strange. It's definitely a movie of its time, but it definitely brings in all these pulp elements, like I said earlier. The adventure, there's a scene where he climbs a wall like of a castle to break into a place, which is recreated in the body rocking video by the Beastie Boys. Yeah, this is a fun flick. Just true fun all around, and yeah, it's the movie we need to explore supervillainy.
It's interesting because when I was watching the trailer, I hadn't seen this one either, but it most certainly made me think of a cross between James Bond and Batman from 1960s. And it also kind of gave me this vibe of like a Bonnie and Clyde feel. Is that kind of how it takes itself?
Yeah, a little bit, but it never takes itself seriously. So, the ending of Bonnie and Clyde, you can cut that part out. But yeah,
Okay.
just getting away with a robbery and then making love in a rotating bed filled with, the entire cash flow of a small European country.
Yeah, James Bond and Batman in the 1960s. That's what it sounds like for sure. Yeah, it was a cool choice, and especially like the way that it ended. And I'm not going to spoil it for any of those who may be interested, but the ending of the trailer in and of itself, I was just like, wow. I was like, that's pretty out there. Yeah. All right, my friend, and take us to your number one top comic book movie classic.
Yeah, I struggled with this one because I really was trying to piece together what's the best comic book movie I could think of. Um, and I kept coming back and coming back to this one. And I have to say, yes, I think this is by far the best comic book adaptation ever made. It is Scott Pilgrim versus the World from 2010. I can't believe we're already 11, 12 years away from when this film came out. Um, this movie is based on the comic book series, which I believe is 6 volumes, which is an indie comic that became a huge sensation. It's a Canadian comic book that is an homage to manga in its formats in black and white, and you got to read it from right to left, just like Japanese comics, but it's in English, and it's a love letter to indie rock music. It's a love letter to video games, and it's just got a great heart to it, and it's got some really emotionally complex moments in the comic book. And this adaptation takes all of 6 of those volumes and squeezes it into one fantastic film. Um, and it's a story of this idiot Scott who is a sort of a layabout, and he's in a band that's going nowhere, and he wants to date this woman named Ramona Flowers. But in order to date her, he's got to fight her 7 evil exes, and each ex in the film has a different aesthetic, and it's got highly inventive fight scenes that kind of steal from different genres of film. There's a Bollywood one. There's this sort of Japanese themed one. There is some really great choreography in all the fights, but each of them have a different character aesthetic to them, and really plays on the idea of how much influence video games has in the world of these young people. And if it was based on a video game, well, it's not based on a video game, but I would still say it's probably the best video game movie ever made, just because of the aesthetic of it, and all the things that it includes, like Zelda and Dance Dance Revolution and Guitar Hero, all these things in there. It just wraps up all these things greatly, and it's one of the most highly inventive films you could probably ever see.
Okay, I need to breathe. I'm gonna be straight up with you here, man, and let you know and let all Lo-Fi listeners out there know that our movie list friendship is on the line with this one. Okay, I could
Oh,
not.
really?
You put this film, which I'm not going to utter its name again, but you put it before The Crow and Akira. I was like, breathe, breathe. We gotta take it easy because I want to hear you out, because I know lots of people love this movie. They claim it's like the best underground and below the radar and great new direction kind of true comic book movie adaptation. So I am not certainly one of those people at all, but I have, I have seen this. It's just been a very long time, and I do trust your movie taste. So since it's been 11 or 12 years since I've seen it, tell me why I should revisit this film.
Yeah, man, I think you should revisit it because, like, if we're talking comic book adaptations, this thing is like reading a live, living, breathing comic book. The sound effects, the background effects to it. There's a really wonderful moment where Scott and Ramona are talking, but all of the lights are blown out behind them, which you're not really paying attention to, but all those little lights are actually transformed into little hearts behind them, and it's just so inventive. Like every single frame of this film has just got either a visual gag, or the fight scenes are incredible. It's got a lot of heart to it. Um, yeah, I'm interested to see, or we're interested to hear what you dislike about this film.
Let me think. Let me think. Where was I 10 to 12 years ago? All right, so now honestly rethinking it, I might have not been paying that much attention when I watched it. Okay, maybe. So I will tell you what, I will take a revisit to this one and I will get back to you on it
Okay.
because I can't think of anything
hmm
offhand
hmm
that struck me why I didn't like it.
Yeah.
But
Okay. Some bad feelings though.
yeah, but
Okay.
again, when I honestly think about it and what I was doing at that time in my life, no, I don't remember that well. And we're not going into that on air either.
All right.
So listeners hit me up with that. I'm not answering. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but no, I definitely know this film as being a film that comic book movie lovers hold in high regard. And it is way outside of the zeitgeist of your DCs or your Marvels. You know, it's an independent comic and it was an independent movie as far as compared to other comic book films in general. And the way that they approached it was so very different. And especially like in the fight scenes where they would actually like take off hit points and you would see like point numbers appearing on the screen like a video
hmm
game. You know, it was very innovative like that. So yeah, I very much know that many people hold this film in high regard, and perhaps I would too if I would remember it better.
Yeah, I also see that there's quite a few things that are not in the film from if you're looking for a one-to-one adaptation. But another great thing about this film is how much of the things that they couldn't adapt into the story are plugged into the set designs or in the background of things or the locations, and just kind of really makes you feel like you're still in this world, even though unfortunately 6 volumes of story can't go into a 2-hour movie. So
Sure, sure.
yeah, but yeah, it's just it's one of the most heartfelt adaptations I think I've ever seen, where you could feel like the people who made it truly loved and respected the source material.
And you know, I will add to that and say it is the most recent inclusion on your list, and it was made during a time where all the other comic book movies were starting out. You know, your Chris Nolan Batmans and your Iron Mans were all starting to come out or out at around that time. So maybe it is time that I go revisit it to see, in a comparison, so many years later, how does it add up to those other films? Very nice, my friend. Very nice. And that's Gregory Day's top 10 list for comic book movie classics. And I got a few questions for you, my friend.
Yeah.
First off, why'd you pick this list this time?
Well, superhero movies are only one aspect of what comic book movies are. And so superhero movies are this huge behemoth taking over our culture. And but they don't really accurately represent even superheroes, but the way they are in comic books. So they're kind of cherry picked from comics by these mega corporate movie productions, and so kind of wanted to give a little spotlight to all the other kind of corners of superhero movies or comic book adaptations or movies um, inspired by comic books. So wanted to give a chance to talk about this because it's such a huge part of our culture right now, and offer some alternatives to anyone who's given a listen.
I like that. And I think, not to dive too far down the rabbit hole, but I think without these films and a lot of their kookiness, we don't get to where we are today with comic book films and superhero films.
hmm
For sure. But another one for you. Do you have any? Because you know, 10 films over such a long time. It's hard to. I can only imagine you have a hard time making your top 10 list every single month. So do you have a couple runners up you want to give some shout outs to?
Yeah. So one, I had to cut them because I didn't want to talk too much about mega um, adaptations, and honestly, I don't really know that much about the source materials to really dive into them. But a couple of choices that I was thinking about was the Lone Wolf and Cub series, which is based on some manga, and the latest Snowblood movie, um, but which I think we talked about before on this show. But the
Yeah.
biggest one I had to cut out of here because I didn't want to do 2 Batman movies was Batman Returns from 1992. It's my favorite Batman movie. It's just a really fucking weird movie.
Is that the
In
James
hindsight,
Schumacher?
no, it's the one right before. It's the one with Danny DeVito plays the Penguin and Michelle
Oh,
Pfeiffer's
right.
Catwoman. Christopher Walken is in it as a corrupt politician. But it's such a strange film. It's incredibly sexually charged. There's some really inappropriate things in there for kids. But it's violent and weird, but it kind of gets into these strange things about identity and like what it means for these characters to be these people, these masked weirdos, and the relationship between the Penguin and Batman, who are both orphaned rich kids who were really mentally fucked up, and then like the Penguin kind of projecting his loss of his parents on Batman and Catwoman. It's just a really strange film at the heart of it, but it's this grand Tim Burton production, which is I think really great because it's all practical, which is the key time of his career as a visual storyteller. So, but I had to get it because I think Batman 66 is a little more. It's much more fun and represents the feel of comic books, whereas this one is much more of a Tim Burton's interpretation of the comic book.
Yeah, I like at least the cinematography and the background city of Gotham that Tim Burton creates
Mm-hmm.
in his Batmans. And he was supposed to create a Superman movie where Nicolas Cage was going to be
Yeah.
Superman. And I would have really liked to have seen a Tim Burton Superman film and what direction that would have taken.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But no go. So it is what it is. But now let me ask you a bit of a compare and contrast between these genre comic book movies and these classics of the past and the comic book movie movement of today. You know, your list is spread out over 70 years or 60 years. And I think maybe that's partially because we really hadn't seen comic book movies be the blockbusters that they are today, you know, when looking into the past. But that being said, you know, nothing lasts forever. And all genres in films, they have their ebb and flows and their peaks, and sometimes they go out for a while and then they come back like the Western, for instance. Sometimes it's in, and then other times you don't see a Western made for like 10 years. And your personal view on this, do you feel that that will happen with comic book movies today and where they are, or will they keep going strong into the future?
You know, I think superhero films will continue to be as big as they are right now for a while. The comic book movie, I think we're kind of done with that as far as like the money people giving license to people who want to make smaller productions. Because I think the superhero had really won out over adapting all kinds of comics. Um, but honestly, man, I don't really know when this is going to end because I felt like it should have petered out by now, but it's not. It's still going strong. It's still the number one thing in theaters. It's still on every streaming platform. There's a new TV show or series going on, like with Peacemaker or like Moon Knight's coming out from Disney. And then, of course, the Spider-Man, the last one was like the biggest grossing movie last year. But it's inevitable; like it's going to have to burst at some point. And I think the real problem is putting all your eggs in one basket. So instead of diversifying your output as a studio, you're putting all your money into superhero films, and eventually it's going to have to come crashing down. I don't know what that point is going to be because I honestly thought it would have happened by now, but I think it's inevitable. So we'll just have to see what it takes to have people turn away from this genre. I think if you look at other genres like the Western, which really did carry through for many decades, but I think modernization and the influence of other types of action films or mystery films helped um, change audiences' tastes. And right now, with the way the world is, all the stresses and concerns that people have about their personal lives or income or the state of the world, politics, all that stuff, going to the movies to see these types of films helps them step away from that. Gives them 2 to 2.5 hours of time to breathe and not be in their own existence. So it's hard to say when I think when these films are gonna disappear from our pop culture.
I think there's so many good points in there. And so a lot of people, two things, they thought kind of after, you know, your what was it, your Avengers Endgame and all that stuff, like they thought that was going to be the end of Marvel for a while. They thought that
Mhm.
superhero movies were going to go down, and DC superhero movies had already been decreasing in box office sales. And then you get like this year and a half of the world and what it's been, and the box office is like nothing. And then boom, Spider-Man hits theaters, and now it's at over 1.8 billion dollars.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, two things: people are definitely going back to the movies to make that kind of box office take. Number two, they're spending that kind of money on a superhero movie still.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. It really is hard to say when superhero movies will go down. But I do like the fact that you differentiated between superhero and comic books. because a lot of your choices were comic book films, not superhero films. And I think you may be right that comic book films that are not also superhero films, I don't know when is the last one I saw of that. Do you have a thought maybe on that? When's the last comic book film we saw that wasn't a superhero film?
I'm honestly struggling to think of one that because there was a good period of where they were simultaneously coming out. Like there were films like History of Violence and The Losers and Scott Pilgrim being one of them, were around that 2010 and time period where Iron Man was popular or it made a lot of money, so let's just kind of adapt anything. I think the superheroes definitely won out there. But honestly, I can't think of the last time I saw a movie that came out. Maybe Snowpiercer
Oh, that's
is
a good point.
one that comes to mind. But that's even been a number of years. Yeah, it's tough to say. I'm sure there's something that we're not thinking about, but yeah, it's just nowhere near the bankability of a superhero movie.
Right, right. Yeah, now I'm gonna think about that and probably Google it a little bit later. All right, last one for you, and the one we always come back to, and it's really kind of a two-parter as it always is. But why is this list specifically important to you? And two, why should other people view this list as important as well?
Yeah, I think I'm not so much now, but I used to be a huge comic book reader, and I got into all kinds of aspects of it, and was a very excited audience patron of the superhero film when it started when MCU kicked off. Um, but as the culture went on, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't quite what I get from comics. Like the what I get from comics is that it's so far outside the mainstream. I come here to see highly inventive um, stories from creators and the art and all that. And these films have kind of devolved into disaster films with superheroes in them. And so I want to put this list together to kind of illustrate not only the history but also some the different avenues of comics and how they relate to movies, since movies are the focus here. But yeah, that's why I think it's important to kind of look back and say like, oh, this is just one piece of what comic books are and what the comic book movie is. Um, but I think what's important about the list is, um, there are other things out there. I think as someone who doesn't really watch a lot of these movies anymore, I do look for alternatives, and I hear, you know, things like Peacemaker or the latest Suicide Squad movie, which are related, kind of have these other influences on them and things creeping in to where they don't feel so um, directed at baseline audiences. So um, yeah, I think it's important to kind of look at the history and a diverse mix of things when you're looking at a certain genre. And hopefully, if anyone's listening to this and they're interested in wanting to expand their view of the comic book movie, this would be a good example for them to follow.
I think you're absolutely right. Most of the time, when people think comic book and superhero, they think one and the same, and they think past 10 to 15 years, and that's it. But there's a
Mhm.
long, rich history of it, to be sure, there that offers a completely unique type of cinematic experience that I think is definitely out there for those who want to try something different.
Oh
I
yeah,
like
very
it.
true.
Superb stuff coming at you right there, Lofi listeners. And Gregory Day, thank you so much as always. But before you take off, why don't you tell the good people at home where they can find you on the webs and what you've been working on lately?
Yeah, so I'm working on a long form series about revenge cinema. It's not quite a real genre, but it is sort of a fixation of genre cinema. So I want to really dig my or sink my teeth into what it is to explore revenge in cinema. So you could follow me over on Substack at badday.substack.com to read all my essays. And my latest one is going to be about Lady Snowblood, one of the great revenge films of all time. And then you can also follow me on follow me on Instagram at HipsvilleAD.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on, my friend, as
Of course. Thank you for
always.
having me.
And that's Hipsville AD's top 10 list. Check our friend Gregory Day out online. Follow him everywhere. And if you're interested in writing in the show, write on in Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, email. Let your voice be heard. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we. Talk to you soon, Lofi listeners. Pickering and Day, signing off.
Sayonara.